Rain struck the windows of the old family house with a steady, impatient rhythm, turning the evening into a blurred gray painting beyond the glass. The living room glowed only by the weak light of a single lamp and the orange reflection from the fireplace, while the rest of the house seemed to sink into shadow. The dining table had already been cleared after dinner, but the air still held the smell of roasted meat, tea, and a faint perfume that did not belong there. The mother stood near the doorway, quiet and pale, one hand resting on the back of a chair. The father sat close to the fire, motionless, his face unreadable. The daughter remained by the staircase, silent, watchful, and tense. The son had already gone upstairs, but the floorboards above carried soft pacing sounds, as if even the upper rooms had become uneasy. The entire house felt changed, as though something unseen had entered the walls and refused to leave. At the center of that tension stood a guest who had arrived 2 days earlier. A detective, not a loud man, not a dramatic man, but a man with the kind of eyes that seemed to read the room before the room knew it was being read. The detective had been invited after a strange chain of incidents. Missing letters, a broken lock, a late-night visitor seen near the garden gate, and a family argument that had ended far too abruptly. No one in the house could explain the details in a single clear voice. Everyone had a different version of the truth. The father claimed coincidence. The mother claimed fear. The daughter claimed secrecy. The son claimed nothing at all. The detective said very little in return, only observing the mud on the floor, the position of the clock, the ashes in the fireplace, and the faint smudge on the inside of the front door. Every detail mattered. Every detail meant something. The first clue appeared almost by accident. A silver pocket watch lay on the mantel, but the chain had been wound in a peculiar way, as if removed in haste and then placed back with care. The detective picked up the watch, examined the scratches on the back, and asked a simple question about the last person to touch it. The father answered too quickly. The mother answered too softly. The daughter answered with suspicion. The son, called back downstairs, answered with confusion. The detective turned the watch over once, then twice, then held it near the lamp. A tiny trace of dark powder rested near the hinge. Cold dust, though no coal had been handled in the room that evening. The detective looked toward the fireplace, then toward the study door, then toward the window that faced the garden. The silence after that look felt more dangerous than any accusation. The study became the next place of interest. A narrow room filled with law books, old maps, letters, and a desk crowded with paperwork. On the desk lay a torn envelope, a blue wax seal, and a single page missing the signature line. The detective examined the tear and noticed the rip had begun from the left side rather than the right, indicating the envelope had been opened carefully rather than torn in anger. That detail changed the meaning of the scene completely. Someone had wanted information removed without making a visible mess. The mother insisted no one had entered the study. The father insisted no one had reason to enter the study. The daughter remained unconvinced. The son, standing near the doorway, pointed out that the window latch had been found open that morning, though the rain had not blown it open. The detective smiled very faintly at that. A small observation, but one that fit the pattern. Another clue rested in the garden. Outside, near the rose bushes, faint shoe marks crossed the wet soil. The prints were narrow, deep at the heel, and turned sharply toward the side gate rather than the front path. The detective crouched near the ground, studying the angle, the pressure, and the distance between impressions. Then the detective looked at the family's shoes lined near the back entrance. The mother wore soft indoor slippers. The father wore polished formal shoes with a wider heel. The daughter wore boots with a decorative ridge across the sole. The son wore trainers with a clear tread. None matched the faint marks in the mud. That meant the prints belonged to someone else, or someone had changed shoes before stepping outside. The possibility introduced a second layer of suspicion. The family no longer had only a hidden problem. The family now had a visitor, a lie, and a trail that pointed somewhere beyond the garden wall. The father began to grow restless. Every observation from the detective seemed to make the shoulders stiffer. Every question seemed to make the replies shorter. The mother noticed. The daughter noticed. Even the son, though trying not to listen, noticed. Dinner had turned into a battlefield, disguised as conversation. Breakfast had become a room of careful glances. The father had started leaving the room whenever the detective entered. The mother had started checking the front hall twice before bed. The daughter had started watching the father's phone when it lit up on the table. The son had started hearing footsteps outside the bedroom window at night. And the detective, calm and precise, kept gathering those small pieces of fear as if assembling a larger picture hidden inside plain sight. The turning point came with a violin case. The father did not play violin, had never played violin, and no family member had touched a violin in years. Yet a slim black case had appeared in the downstairs closet, hidden behind winter coats and old umbrellas. The detective found it while inspecting the hallway storage for possible concealment spaces. Inside the case lay not a violin, but documents, a key, and a small folded map marked with pencil circles over several addresses in the city. One address was underlined 3 times. Another was crossed out. A third had a date written beside it. The detective compared the dates with the torn envelope from the study and the muddy shoe prints by the garden. The pattern began to narrow. The father denied all knowledge of the case. The mother denied placing it there. The daughter looked at the father with something close to disappointment. The son stared at the key, sensing that the key mattered even without knowing why. By midnight, the detective requested everyone remain in the parlor. The fire was nearly out. The lamp hissed faintly. Rain still tapped at the glass. The detective stood near the mantel, the violin case on the table, the pocket watch in one hand, and the torn envelope in the other. A room full of silence often becomes a room full of answers once the right question is asked. The detective asked the father where the key belonged. The father refused to answer. The detective asked the mother whether any visitor had entered the home that week. The mother hesitated too long. The detective asked the daughter whether the father had left the house after dark 2 nights earlier. The daughter answered yes, though the answer sounded more like a wow than a statement. The detective asked the son whether any sound had been heard near the side gate. The son whispered yes. The detective nodded once, as if the final piece had fallen into place. The truth was not simple, but the truth was there. The father had not only hidden letters. The father had been meeting someone in secret, though not for the reason everyone first believed. The person outside the family was not a lover, but an old business partner connected to an inheritance dispute, a forged will, and a plan to move money through the family account using the house as cover. The lipstick on the collar had belonged to the business partner's daughter, who had visited once to deliver a parcel and had brushed close to the father during a quick exchange in the foyer. The hotel key card had come from a meeting arranged under false names. The torn envelope had contained proof that another relative was attempting to claim the family property through fraud. The father had hidden the papers because the danger had felt greater than the shame of silence. The mother had discovered fragments and assumed betrayal. The children had seen the symptoms, but not the cause. The detective had seen the shape of the whole crime long before anyone else admitted the possibility. Yet even after that explanation, the damage inside the family did not vanish. The mother still carried humiliation. The daughter still carried anger. The son still carried fear. The father had tried to protect the family through secrecy and had instead poisoned the family through concealment. The detective spoke plainly about that. In every case, truth delayed is truth weaponized. Silence can protect a secret, but silence can also wound everyone standing near it. The room held those words like cold water. The mother cried first, not from the crime itself, but from the realization that the family had been left to suffer while the father tried to solve danger alone. The father lowered the head and finally admitted fault. The daughter asked why no one had been told. The father answered with regret. The son asked whether the family would still remain together. No one answered immediately. The investigation continued into the night. The detective reviewed every document, every note, every receipt, and every schedule. A hidden meeting at the train station had linked the business partner to the forged will. A false signature had been copied from an old legal form. The missing page from the envelope had contained a threat written in careful handwriting. The garden gate had been left open by someone coming from the alley behind the house. The violin case had been used to smuggle legal papers under the cover of a harmless object. The pocket watch had belonged to the father's late uncle, whose estate had become the target of the fraud. The pieces fit with the precision of a locked mechanism clicking open after the final gear is placed. The detective explained that the real thief was not inside the family in the way feared at first. The real thief was after the house, the money, and the inheritance tied to the property itself. The father had met the wrong people, trusted the wrong promise, and then chosen secrecy over honesty. That choice nearly destroyed the household faster than the actual fraud ever could. Morning arrived with the gray softness of a city still sleeping under rain. The detective stood at the window, watching the garden become clearer under daylight. The mother had not slept. The daughter had not slept. The son had slept only a little. The father sat at the table with papers spread out like evidence in a courtroom. There was no need now for drama, only confession. The father spoke at last about the first meeting, the hidden documents, the pressure from the old business partner, the fear of scandal, and the false belief that everything could be corrected before anyone noticed. The story had started with an attempt to shield the family and ended with the family standing on the edge of collapse. The mother listened without interruption. The daughter listened with arms folded. The son listened with tears in the eyes. The detective, having solved, the family followed the detective into the garden. The side gate was still marked by the mud from the night before. Near the rose bushes, a small brass pin lay half hidden in the wet earth. The detective picked it up, identified it as part of a legal seal used by certain offices, and explained that the pin matched the office of the forged documents. The proof was enough to expose the entire scheme. But the more important proof was not the brass pin. The more important proof was the realization that every person in the house had been caught inside a story no one understood fully until too late. The mother had assumed betrayal. The children had assumed betrayal. The father had assumed secrecy could still count as protection. The detective had assumed a hidden crime, and that assumption proved correct, but even correctness could not erase the emotional wreckage left behind. The family confrontation that followed was quiet, far quieter than the earlier argument. The mother asked whether love had been lost. The father answered that love had not been lost, but trust had been damaged. The daughter asked whether the father would ever stop keeping dangerous secrets. The father answered no in the past tense, then yes in the future tense, because honesty had finally become the only possible path forward. The son asked whether the house would still feel like home. The detective, standing slightly apart, said that a home is not defined by perfect behavior, but by whether truth is allowed to live inside it. That answer stayed in the room longer than any accusation. The mother looked at the father for a long time. The father looked back without defense. The daughter looked away first. The son slowly reached for a chair and sat down. The conversation did not end the pain, but the conversation made healing possible. Later that day, the authorities arrived to collect the legal papers and open the investigation into the forged will. The business partner and the partner's daughter were named in the case. The false claims against the property began to collapse under scrutiny. The detective prepared a final report, neat and detailed, with a timeline that connected the evening visitor, the hidden key, the torn envelope, the gate prints, and the financial records. Justice, at least in part, had begun its work. But justice did not restore emotional safety by itself. That required time. That required apology. That required patience. The family remained in the house together after the police left. No one celebrated. No one felt victorious. The rain finally softened, and the room became less cold, though still heavy with what had happened. The detective returned once more before leaving. The detective placed the pocket watch on the table and said the watch had been wound too tightly for weeks, perhaps months, until the spring inside was close to breaking. The remark sounded almost like a metaphor, though presented like a diagnosis. The family understood. When pressure remains hidden too long, the failure arrives suddenly and loudly. The father thanked the detective. The mother thanked the detective. The children said nothing, but the silence now carried a different meaning. It was no longer the silence of suspicion. It was the silence of exhaustion after truth. The detective left the house with umbrella in hand, coat collar raised, and the calm expression of someone who has seen human weakness often enough to know that weakness and cruelty are not always the same thing. Days later, the family began clearing the table with slower hands and steadier movements. A meal was eaten together without shouting. The daughter asked about the old photos in the hallway. The mother answered. The son asked about the garden. The father answered. Small questions returned first, then small answers. The house did not heal all at once, but the atmosphere changed by degrees. The fear receded. The daughter stopped watching every movement with suspicion. The son stopped flinching at footsteps. The mother stopped checking the door twice before bed. The father stopped disappearing into silence at the first sign of trouble. The detective's work had exposed the crime. The family's work began after that, in the slower and more difficult task of learning how to speak without hiding. Weeks passed. The forged will case moved through formal channels. The hidden inheritance dispute became public. The family reputation suffered, then stabilized. The children learned that scandal can pass through a house like fire through dry grass, but that the house can still stand if the people inside refuse to surrender to despair. The father worked to rebuild trust by telling the truth before the truth was demanded. The mother rebuilt trust by asking questions openly. The daughter rebuilt trust by listening without assuming the worst immediately. The son rebuilt trust by speaking about fear instead of burying it. The detective's final visit came on a clear morning. The detective said the case was not perfect, but it was resolved. Then the detective added that the true mystery had never been the fraud itself. The true mystery had been how a family could stand so close to each other and still feel so far apart. That mystery was not solved by evidence. That mystery could only be answered by time, honesty, and the choice to remain. By autumn, the house looked the same from the outside. Same brick walls, same narrow path, same front gate. Yet inside, the rooms carried a different sound. Laughter returned first in small pieces, then in longer stretches. Dinner became ordinary again. The old clock in the hall ticked on, no longer a symbol of danger, but a sign that life had continued. The pocket watch sat in a drawer now, repaired and cleaned. The violin case had been emptied and stored away. The garden gate had been fixed. The side path had been repaved. The mother once again placed flowers near the window. The daughter once again lingered in the kitchen after dinner. The son once again ran through the hallway without fear. The father once again sat near the fire, not as a man hiding in shadow, but as a man trying to live in the light. And somewhere in the memory of that house, the detective's calm voice remained, like a final lesson about truth, family, and the fragile line between protection and deception.